Assalamu alaikum. Today we have Ashar Aziz with us. He is the founder of the cybersecurity firm FireEye, and more recently he founded Sky Electric, which is a company which provides modern solar energy solutions for homes and businesses. Mr. Aziz is one of the rare successes in Pakistan when it comes to the tech world, and thank you so much for your time, Mr. Aziz. Firstly, I wanted to ask you about your early life. So, growing up in Pakistan, how did you venture forth from? What were your ambitions in your early life, basically?
Yeah. So, in the early days, this was pre-internet. I used to spend a fair amount of time researching scientists and inventors and entrepreneurs, and I was fascinated by their lives, and I thought that was the path that I wanted to follow. And so one of my family members, he suggested that I should consider going to the United States for school, a technical school, and school called MIT, so it's well known around here. And he said, well, why don't you go and see if you can get admission there. And so I tried to figure that out when I was a kid. I used to live here in Islamabad, and the knowledge of how to apply was not common. So I went to the American Center and I tried to figure it out, but they weren't super helpful. And so I finally figured out indirectly that there was a scholarship for a school in Turkey, and that if you went to that school and you did well there, that you would find a way to transfer to MIT. So I applied. There was a scholarship to go to such a school. It was called the RCD scholarship. So I applied for that scholarship. I managed to win that scholarship, and I went to Turkey. And from there, it turned out that the big difference in Turkey and here was they simply had a better knowledge base as to how to apply to US schools. So that was sort of the big learning there. And so I applied to MIT from there, and then I eventually got admission, went to MIT, and from there, when I graduated from there, I moved to Silicon Valley, and the goal was always to figure out how to be an entrepreneur and start a technology company. It took a little bit of time. It took me about 10 to 14 years after I finished school to figure out how to connect the dots between a technology idea and venture funding. And so by the time it was 1998, I had a technology idea that I was just sort of discussing with a venture capitalist in the area, and he got very enamored with the idea, and he decided to, hey, if you want to build a company, I'll fund you to do this. So that's how my first startup began. It was a company called TerraSpring, and was started in sort of the height of the .com and the telco boom. But anytime there's a big boom, there's usually a bust that follows. So that 1999 boom was followed by a bust in the 2001 and 2 timeframe. And we were caught in that middle of that bust. We had raised about 70 million or so in venture, and we even managed to get $30 million of revenue in our first year, which is pretty good. But all in all, the business was poorly positioned to survive the downturn, and I ended up selling the company to Sun Microsystems. And then I went and worked there for another year before I took off to start FireEye. So that's sort of a brief from start to my first company and leading up to FireEye.
Okay, great. And FireEye is the company you formed it's a cybersecurity firm, and you founded this in 2004.
That's right.
Can you tell us a bit about how you came up with the idea for FireEye?
Yeah, it's actually a somewhat interesting story. When my first startup was bought by Sun Microsystems, I spent 2 days with the US Navy going over their needs for computing inside a ship. My first company was building automated data centers. That was the goal of the first company. So that technology was being discussed with the US DoD and specifically the US Navy. And the Navy runs ships, and ships are essentially big, large floating data centers. So they have a lot of space and power constraints. And so what I found very interesting with that interaction was they had very precisely detailed requirements on how they wanted their data centers to be automated, to be managed. And when I started my first company, although it was trying to do the same thing, I did not have the benefit of reading their requirements document. So I thought this is very well thought through. They're very sophisticated end user as an enterprise customer. And that thought stuck with me. My philosophy as an entrepreneur is to look for problems. Okay, so I don't look for startup ideas. I look for big problems that are poorly addressed in the market. And then I try to build a company and technology and business around that problem statement. So I was pursuing a problem statement, the search for a problem when I wanted to do my second startup. I didn't have a problem in hand, so I was looking for different problems. And I went looking in the DoD archives because of my prior experience with the US Navy, thinking maybe there's another problem around which they have specified requirements, and maybe I can go figure out how to solve that problem. And so I found the problem of stealthy cyber attacks in the DoD archives, specifically the DARPA archives. And that started a whole chain of thought processes that I engaged in. And I started studying the problem more. I got more interested in the problem. So I was studying about 4 or 5 different problems in parallel to the problem of stealthy cyber attacks and cybersecurity. And then I decided to focus purely on the cybersecurity problem. At the time I started, I didn't really have a great solution, but it took me about 4-ish months to come up with the rough blueprint of what became eventually FireEye's product technology. So I spent about 10 months working on it in my living room, essentially fleshing out the technology and validating the solution market fit with potential enterprise customers. And so by the end of 2004, I had a fairly well-developed technology blueprint, and I also had validation from enterprise customers. So I raised my first round of funding, seed funding in the end of 2004, and the first full round of funding early 2005. So that's sort of how I began FireEye.
Okay, great. In one of your interviews, you mentioned that this is the information age as opposed to the previous industrial age. And in this age, companies value their data a lot, spending as much as $80 billion a year on security alone. So at the same time, when you look at people, ordinary people, they obviously can't spend much money on their own data protection online. So when it comes to protecting your own privacy, what do you think an ordinary person can do to protect their personal data in today's world?
Right. So privacy of your data has many different dimensions when it comes to the consumer. Unfortunately, we freely give it away on social media sites. So social media and participation in social media is the exact opposite of privacy. If you want privacy, you should not be on social media, period, right? Because it's not just that other people will collect data on you. All the organizations that want to target you for different kinds of commercial or political messages will also be gathering data on you. And unfortunately, you're not their customer. I don't think you've ever written a check to any of the social media companies. You're their product. They're selling you, exactly. Right? So being mindful of the fact that you're not the customer, you think you're a customer of any social media website, you're really not. You're actually their product. They're selling information about you to the people who want to target you, and they're willing to pay these companies for those commercial messages, right? So that's sort of the nature of the game. So there's that aspect of consumer privacy that everybody needs to be mindful of, and one simple option is to simply opt out, right? Just get out of the broad-based engagement with social media platforms. The other is more cyber criminal oriented, right? So criminals can target you and try to get your credit card or other information. And there's not a lot, unfortunately, that consumers can do to protect against that kind of a theft, because the security tools on smartphones in general are poor. And I would say the security tools even on your average consumer laptop are not super well built. So there's not a lot of technology in the consumer domain to protect you from a very targeted attack. Everybody claims to have great technology, but most of the technology that I'm aware of sits in the enterprise realm. They're not consumer offerings, so not a great thing there. But I'm just going to give the advice that everybody talks about, being mindful of emails that you receive that sound suspicious, and don't fall for every email phishing scam, and that's usually how most of these attacks work.
Okay, great. Recently in Pakistan, there was a cybersecurity attack. So I think they targeted a lot of banks, and a lot of people lost their data, and a lot of money was lost. What do you think about the cybersecurity environment in Pakistan, and how do you think these attacks on banks, for example, can be prevented?
Right. So banks are a rich target for attacks. Of course, I've sold to a large number of banks with FireEye's products and technology, and they're not immune to cyber attacks. That said, your credit card information is available in many places other than banks themselves. So while the headline said banks are targeted, in reality, it was point of sale terminals that were targeted outside the bank, not inside the bank. So if your point of sale terminal where you swipe your card, that is going to read your card information and then process it in the clear, well, that's a perfect place to steal credit card information. So unfortunately, with a credit card, where you're reading the magnetic stripe for information, that's actually bad technology because it can be intercepted in many different parts of the ecosystem. Point of sale terminal just happens to be one of them. A better thing to do would be to avoid the use of credit card numbers in the clear, to have cards that have chips in them that you insert, and there's a chip reader, and so it's much harder to steal the information out of the card itself. Banks should probably upgrade their cards to that kind of technology, which is now in the process of happening in most of the rest of the developed world. Having said that, I think it's important that banks and all critical infrastructure, bank happens to be one of the critical infrastructure, should adopt a policy of cybersecurity vigilance, and the government should also get engaged with the private sector to come up with guidelines and rules as to how these attacks should be best mitigated, and come up with cybersecurity best practices. Singapore is an example of a country that the government has been very active in cybersecurity regulations, and all the banks and financial institutions in Singapore have to adhere to very stringent cybersecurity standards. I would say that's probably not even keel in terms of that kind of cybersecurity vigilance in the rest of the world. So the United States is still trying to figure out what's the best cybersecurity regulation, for example. But Singapore, being a very tightly controlled and less opposition, less political chaos kind of a country, they've been able to promulgate these cybersecurity policies and regulations more easily. I would encourage the local government to come up with such policies and make the banks and other financial institutions and other kinds of critical infrastructure, such as telco and energy companies, also adhere to more stringent cybersecurity regulations.
Okay, great. Currently, when I think an ordinary person thinks of cybersecurity threats, they think of something like viruses and spywares and Trojans. Do you think AI represents a significant threat to cybersecurity in the future?
Yeah, so AI is a double-edged sword. AI can be used to defeat cyber threats, and AI can be used to create cyber threats. So it's like any technology, any fundamental technology, you can use it in either direction. So there are already a lot of companies that are building AI as part of a defensive strategy, right? So I can use machine learning to figure out if this file or this flow on the network is malicious or not. Similarly, as an attacker, I can come up with a better, more stealthy attack by using AI to generate that. So that is going to continue to be an arms race. AI is kind of like computing technology. It's as fundamental as that, right? It's an enhanced computing technology. And so computing technology can be used to create malicious code and defensive code, and AI will be used in both realms.
Okay. FireEye, as you mentioned, has worked with the U.S. Department of Defense. I think they invested in FireEye.
Right. So it wasn't exactly the U.S. Department of Defense, it was the U.S. intelligence community.
Okay.
So the investing arm was In-Q-Tel, which invests on behalf of the broader U.S. intelligence community.
Okay. So my question is, have you ever worked with the Pakistani government against cyber attacks?
Yes. So FireEye has a pretty significant presence in Pakistan. We've had it for over 5-6 years now. And we have sold to various government elements. I'm not at liberty to disclose all of them, as well as many banks and other commercial enterprises in the country. So we have a robust presence in Pakistan. And of course, I'm sure the government, I would still encourage the government to come up with better policies and regulations, but FireEye as a commercial entity has been engaged here for quite some time.
Okay, so moving on from FireEye to Sky Electric. These are two completely different, I'd say, industries. So how did you go from that idea of cybersecurity to Sky Electric?
Right, so as I mentioned earlier, I'm always looking for problems to solve that are getting worse over time. And the problem that I am trying to address with Sky Electric is twofold. One is the energy crisis in the developing world. I think it's no secret that there's a mismatch between supply and demand in most developing countries, particularly as population increases. It's difficult for the generation capacity to fully keep up to speed. There's generation capacity, there's transmission and distribution capacity, right? They're both straining to meet the demands of a developing country, becoming more urban, more industrial, and then on top of it, a higher population base. And this profile is not just for Pakistan, it's for 30 to 40 other developing countries in the world that are struggling to increase their per capita consumption of electricity. So the second question arises, where is this extra energy going to come from? So the other main problem that we have in the 21st century is a climate problem, right? We are endangering the planet with harmful emissions of carbon dioxide that is creating all sorts of negative side effects in the climate ecosystems around the planet. So clean and renewable sources of energy are preferred over dirty sources of energy like coal or even natural gas power plants. Any fossil fuel, anytime you burn it, you're going to release carbon dioxide. So it's a two-part thing. From a customer's perspective, they may or may not care about climate change, but they care about the fact that they don't have power, and B, making that power cheaply available to them. It's always a personal economic calculation that everybody does. So bringing the cost of providing this renewable energy footprint down so that people in the middle class and even lower middle class can afford it. That is sort of the goal of Sky Electric, and it's to apply technology, not just solar panels, but software technology, electronics, power electronics, battery technology to the full problem of energy management.
Okay, as you were mentioning, it's not exactly solar, it's energy management, as you said. And can you tell us more about your product? How is it different from conventional solar solutions?
Absolutely. So solar panels are widely available, and it's a commodity available from companies around the world. China seems to be leading in that industrial footprint right now, but other countries, United States, has a footprint as well. So panels are one aspect of this solution. In this country, 47 to 48% of total power consumption is residential. With residential consumption, the pattern in Pakistan is the same as in the rest of the world, which is there's a small peak in the morning, there's a midday trough, and then there's a peak in the evening, which is completely the opposite of solar power availability, right? Solar power starts off small in the morning, peaks in the middle of the day, and then comes down as the sun sets in the evening. So the first problem you have to solve is how do you figure out the mismatch between solar power availability and actual consumption of that power. So the battery technology that we have designed is intelligent battery. It's not just there to provide backup power when the grid goes off in the middle of the night. That's one of the functions of the battery technology. The other function is to intelligently manage the total energy and discharge the energy into the home that is from the lowest and cleanest source. So if it has solar available, it will run the whole day on solar, including in the evening, right? When there is no sun, it'll take the excess solar, it'll store it in the battery pack, and when the home loads start turning on in the evening, it will discharge the solar energy in the evening. This is called solar self-consumption. You can always sell the excess solar back to the main grid, and fortunately, all over Pakistan, net metering policies are now in effect, so you can have a reversible meter that allows you to sell your excess energy back to the main grid. And so the system here is designed to do that as well, but it does an intelligent calculation of what will be the return if I sell to the grid at low tariff rate, which is the current rate that net metering provides you, and what will be the benefit if I self-consume, and it creates an optimal mix of both of these things. It also does things like intelligent charging. So if your battery is about to go low and it's high tariff period, it says, it's okay, I'll wait until the low tariff period comes in, because the high tariff period is typically from 5 p.m. to 8 or 9 p.m. in the evening. It varies by summer and winter time frames. And so if it's around 8:30, it's not going to start charging the battery, because it knows that after 9 p.m. it's going to get half the rate to charge the battery. Similarly, in early morning, if it's going down and the sun is going to come up, the system has a complete weather prediction for the next 24 hours for the home that you're sitting in. So it says, I'm going to just wait. The sun is about to rise. I'm going to get free solar energy. There's no reason for me to start charging from the grid right now. So intelligent energy management to lower the bill, that's sort of one of the big differentiators. The battery technology is based on lithium-ion batteries, which have a much, much longer cycle life. They can last easily 10 years or longer, versus the existing lead-acid batteries that last 1 to 2 years, and then you have to completely replace them for new batteries. The round-trip efficiency of the lithium-ion batteries is way better than the round-trip of the lead-acid batteries. It's close to 97% round-trip efficiency, whereas you'd be lucky to get 80% from a lead-acid battery. On top of this sort of technology inside the box, if you will, we are bringing all 21st century technology to bear on the problem. So all the systems are cloud connected. They all have a Wi-Fi and 3G link built into it. So they are always sending a heartbeat of status and fault information into the cloud. And the cloud information is monitored 24/7 in a network operations center by qualified electrical technicians. So if there is any kind of a fault, and a fault can develop because you put on too much load in the system and the system is trying to recover from that. Or there was some kind of disturbance on the grid that has created some kind of fault condition inside your home and the power electronics of the system itself. The network operations center is able to come in over the internet, connect into the system, remotely diagnose it, and if possible, remotely fix it as well. So that electronics to do the remote diagnosis and the remote fixing is built into the product itself. Customer support is not an afterthought. It's not like a number that you dial when you have a problem. We of course have that. Customer support has been bolted inside the product. It's inherently part of the product design. The product comes with a team of qualified electrical technicians attached to it 24/7. They're always looking at it. So even if you don't know there's a problem, the NOC can see the problem, perhaps before you do, and it can come in and fix it. So the cloud-based NOC, the artificial intelligence software that we have to manage the energy mix in the most efficient way, and the battery stack, all of these are profound differentiators. And our product pricing is within 10% of all the other products, even though its economic value over time is much greater. The battery technology by itself is going to last 5 to 6 times longer than the current battery technology in the market. And then the AI software is going to reduce your bills dramatically. So you get a payback with respect to existing systems very, very rapidly.
Absolutely. So I have a question related to that. you mentioned that solar power is obviously a renewable source of energy and it's climate eco-friendly. But the government of Pakistan, they've invested a lot in non-eco-friendly, like fossil fuels, especially coal recently. They've invested a lot in coal. So my question is, what do you think, how much of Pakistan's energy mix do you think solar power can eventually be? What percentage of Pakistan's energy mix do you think solar power can contribute?
That's a great question. So the things to keep in mind here are there's two main questions. Where is the energy being produced and where is it being consumed? And this question is an important question because when I put a coal plant or a dam, even hydroelectric, which is renewable, or any other kind of power plant in the middle of the grid, it has to traverse the transmission and distribution grid before it comes to your home or your office. The line losses, just the technical line losses on the grid in developing countries, including Pakistan, are anywhere from 15 to 20%. Now, we're also aware that there is theft, which is essentially non-metered access or non-payment of bills, right? These two things add another 10 to 15% to the loss, economic loss matrix. So you're looking at a 20 to 30% economic loss of a unit which is sent from the middle of the grid to the edge of the grid, which is where most people and businesses are. So for this system to become efficient, it has to recover from its losses. So while we have the issue of coal, that's of course a problem for the climate, and it may sound on paper cheaper because I'm just looking at the levelized cost of producing a unit from coal. The reality is by the time it comes to your house, it's dropped in value by 30%. So this argues, in my view, for a distributed generation and consumption style. When I put rooftop panels on my home, there's no transmission and distribution grid in the middle. The power comes from my roof on a line that's 100 feet long directly into my loads, right? So that entire problem of a transmission and distribution grid, which is unreliable because of just maintenance issues, it's prone to failures. That entire problem has been shorted out of this architecture. Now, the second question is around cost. Today, already, with the Sky Electric product, with storage, with batteries thrown in there, the levelized cost is when I take the entire cost of owning and operating a piece of power equipment, and I look at the entire energy produced by that piece of equipment over the life of the equipment. It's called the levelized cost. It's the only way to compare two different power generation capacities. That levelized cost today is cheaper than the low tariff grid today, okay? So this is a much more scalable and cost-effective platform. So I think that distributed solar and distributed renewable is a much better answer because you have to make a huge capital investment to the transmission and distribution grid continuously to make it keep pace with the increasing demand on that grid. Whereas you avoid that stress with a distributed architecture. If you were to put in pure solar panels with no storage today, that on a levelized cost of electricity basis is the cheapest source of power today. So never mind the fact that it is economically beneficial, it's clean and renewable, it's also the cheapest one. We are now seeing bids in the 2 to 3 cents per unit in the global market for utility scale solar. And it's only going to come down over time, not go up. So economically and from a climate sense and from a transmission and distribution architecture of developing worlds, and the features that I've just talked about, the line losses and the non-recovery of bills, either through non-metered access, which is called illegal hooking around here, or just non-payment of bills, that entire problem can be bypassed if we build a renewable distributed solar architecture.
Yeah, so as you were mentioning, I think there's a lot of misinformation about solar power, or people simply don't understand it. especially in Pakistan. From what you've said, solar power is decreasing, the cost of solar power is decreasing over time, and it will continue to decrease. Do you think that apart from solar power, what else do you think has potential in Pakistan? Wind energy, or do you think solar power is the best solution for Pakistan?
So wind in general is a very low cost source of energy, and it's being built up all over the world. And I think wind would be a great source of energy if we didn't have a lossy transmission and distribution grid. Wind, by definition, has to be centralized. It's very difficult to put distributed wind because wind is moving at high altitudes. It's not moving at rooftop level. So if you want to harvest wind, you have to build a tower that's pretty tall, and that becomes unsightly for most residential and commercial structures, right? So it's not a practical solution. I did spend a fair amount of time exploring alternate wind turbine designs to solve these issues, but at the end I decided it was not a very scalable and easily deployable platform in all of these different environments. So wind is a good source, but the transmission and distribution grid is the problem, and you'll have the 30% haircut of the energy units. Main hydro, the things we talk about, the dam, I think it's fine. We still have to solve the problem of the transmission and distribution. I'm especially fond of micro hydro. I think micro hydro can be scaled out all over the country because there's lots of rivers, and you don't have to create the big capital investment of a big reservoir of water and all the issues that come, the political and other issues that come with it. If you have a run-of-the-river micro hydro, I think that's a great thing. And wherever that's feasible or possible, there should be all sorts of incentives for people to do that, right? So run-of-the-river micro hydro is a great, again, it's clean, it's renewable, and it can be done in pieces. And if you're doing it in a place where the people who are consuming it are right there, then again, you have a much simpler transmission and distribution problem, right? So I like it from that perspective. But other than that, I think on a long term, the distributed architecture to me is the most resilient and the most scalable over time.
Just going on from that question, you mentioned you like micro hydro better, but in Pakistan recently with the Supreme Court and Prime Minister's Dam Fund, that's a massive project. It's a massive undertaking, and it's a very costly project. What's your personal view about that project? Do you think there's a better solution to that?
I'd say that the thing with mega projects in developing worlds is it's difficult to execute upon, and it's a long time horizon to get anywhere, right? So that's not a simple solution. It's not going to happen in the next couple of years, anytime, anywhere, right? So if you want to start doing something now, I think lots and lots of small-scale projects are better than one big giant bet. You don't want to bet the farm on one big thing. I know people have different points of view on this, and maybe my point of view is different than many people, but I like projects that are not this big bang project, which can then have all sorts of execution problems come in late in the day, right? Yeah. Mega projects are typically over budget and far extend beyond their planned completion deadline, right? So I've never seen a mega project complete on time and on budget. It's never happened, not to my knowledge.
That's true. So you mentioned that 48% of Pakistan's electrical usage is residential. So as far as solar goes, especially your company, what percentage of that 48% do you have a target in mind that you want that to be solar?
I mean, ultimately, I would want it to be 100%. I don't see any reason why it shouldn't be, because there is enough power on the average home in a country with the landmass of Pakistan to power that home. So we're not Hong Kong, where it's a tiny landmass and everybody's living in long tall towers. That's where the energy production and the energy consumption per square foot is completely off. In a large landmass country like Pakistan, with lots and lots of adequate rooftop space, there is no issue with space. Every home here can have enough energy to power their home all year round. There is no issue with that. So, and as I go smaller, well, the power needs of the smaller homes are also smaller, right? So I can come up with a much smaller footprint for a smaller home that'll still fit on their rooftop. So from a space availability, from a growth perspective, as the population is growing, it's a bit ambitious to say that, but I see no reason why it shouldn't be 100%.
And what do you think is the hurdle right now towards that? What are the challenges you faced in making solar power?
The first challenge we face is lack of awareness of the solution and what it can do. There's a lot of misinformation in the market, and there's a lot of sort of impression that solar hasn't worked well or hasn't worked well in the past. And every time you dig into that, why it hasn't worked, it's not because the solar panel stopped working, which sometimes it's happened, but if that has to be a really poor quality panel. Mostly it's because the system was cobbled together by people who are really importers here. They're not technology or product companies. And so they don't really understand the technology very well. And it's been mated with like this really old, early 20th century kind of battery technology, the lead acid batteries that we have in our cars, right? That sort of is their storage platform. And there's no intelligence or management around that. So every time you look to see what failed, it was the battery that failed. But then because it was as part of the solar system failed, right? And it was actually a weak battery design that failed. So I think understanding and decoupling these sort of technical components in the stack, the battery and solar, and then putting together a combined stack that leverages the latest advances in technology. So lithium ion, of course, is gaining a lot of momentum because it's in every device that we use. It's in your smartphone, it's in your laptop. Now it's going to be in electric vehicles. And so that benefit of that large supply chain is coming to home energy storage as well. So we have really good technology with lithium ion batteries. We're probably the only company at scale offering that technology in the country right now. So I think people don't understand, oh, there's lithium ion and what can it do and how is it different? Isn't a battery just a battery? So there's that kind of education that needs to happen. Why do I need software? Isn't the panel good enough? So I just explained all the reasons why you might need software, right? And there's no other company that has actually tried to address it from this holistic perspective. So education. When we do get in front of the customer, we have an extremely high close rate of the customer. If there's an issue, it's simply that, oh, how do I divide this payment up into some chunks of time, maybe over a year or 2 years, so I don't have to pay that thing up front. That may be the only other thing that comes in the middle. There's bank financing and other things that are available to go help with that part of the picture. But by and large, in this country, financing is not the most common way to finance things. In the mortgage industry, it's less than 1% of all homes, and homes are much more capital intensive than my product, and they're being financed out of cash as well, right? So I think it's really the first problem, which is the awareness problem. People understand a UPS battery, which is, again, obsolete technology, and people understand diesel or gas generators, which are even more obsolete technology.
So I think energy is obviously a very important issue in Pakistan. I think 1/3 of our imports are energy imports. So have you approached the government with your ideas, or has the government approached you?
You know, we work with different parts of the government. I have not engaged with this new government, which is because I think there are plenty of other things that they have to worry about in their first 100 days of government. But to the government's credit, you have to give credit where it's due. And this happened some time ago. They allowed all of the utilities in the country to in fact, they encouraged them to facilitate net metering. And net metering simply means I have excess solar energy, I'll sell it back on the grid, and I'll get a benefit on my bill for that. That's a really cool thing to be able to do at the end of the day, right? Yes, we have lots of software that takes advantage of how and when to net meter and to get the best economic advantage for the consumer out of it, but just the ability to export your excess solar back out to the main grid is a very powerful one. And I think that's a great policy that has been promulgated by the government or the utility architecture in general. Having said that, it's still difficult to get that license, right? Because it's still a little bit of a bureaucratic set of hurdles that you have to jump through to get the net metering meter installed and to get all the permits that you need to do that. Sky Electric actually does this for all our customers. We don't charge a dime for it, we just do it. It's actually a lot of running around by our people. We have a whole dedicated team of people dedicating to going around on behalf of every customer, making sure that the meter is right, making sure they have the utility approval, the NEPRA approval, and all the various approvals that are needed. So it's a free service that we provide to our customers, but the fact that we can do it is extremely powerful. I'll say, if you look across the border, in India, it's still really hard to get that done. It's really hard to go get net metering done. Everybody talks about it. On the ground, it's very, very hard to do. And you know, right now, of all the customers that I have, about 60% are already exporting. They have net metering license, and the rest of them are in process because we are gaining customers really fast, and it can take a month or two to get it done. So we have a very good track record with getting them to, and you know, one of the beautiful things about when you have the net metering license, you'll see a negative bill. I don't think everybody's ever seen a negative bill. It means a utility owes you money. That's a great feeling. And I've seen that on so many of my customers' bills, and even on my own property here, that's a great thing to have.
That is. Moving on from Sky Electric, obviously you've been an entrepreneur, you've been at that stage where you have an idea and you believe in that idea. What advice would you give a budding tech entrepreneur in Pakistan or a startup in Pakistan?
My advice is for entrepreneurs to focus on problems, right? Poorly addressed problems represent underserved markets. And the problem may be unique to your environment. That's why it's somebody sitting here on the ground can address that problem better than somebody sitting in California or Silicon Valley or China. Because you are very close to the problem, you can see the issues. And once you have done that, and once you have thought of a solution, test that solution with the market before you spend a lot of time and effort to scale it up. Make sure it's the right solution and that the problem is real and people are willing to pay to solve that problem. That's the most fundamental thing that a business can do, because products are tools to solve our everyday problems, right? And so you have to make sure this is the right tool for the kind of problem that is not being well addressed in the market.
So in Pakistan, startups and entrepreneurs, they struggle to get funding, and as opposed to somewhere like US where more funding is available for these ideas. Do you have any plans yourself to invest in startups or ideas in Pakistan?
So, you know, I get asked that question a lot, and my personal sort of view is that I'm a better entrepreneur than I'm an investor, right? So investing is another profession, and of course I know a lot of investors and I work with many of them. I don't consider myself a great investor because you have to, in order to be a disciplined investor, you have to go in and do a lot of diligence on the company, the team, the product, the market problem, right? And that is not a part-time activity, right? It's a full-time activity. And as a full-time, I'm an entrepreneur. I've got this company and I'm building one or two other companies in parallel, right? That combined is 150% time commitment. So you don't do, it's not a hobby that I would be able to say, okay, you know, come and let me invest, sounds good, right? I would love to be able to say, sounds good, but investing is not simple enough that one can simply look at a plan and say, sounds good. You have to actually work a lot to make sure that it's actually the right plan. And that, to me, the best investors are full-time investors. They're not hobbyists in the investing space. Just like entrepreneurship is not a hobbyist job, investing is not a hobbyist job. So I have to pick my profession, and the profession that I'm most comfortable is as an entrepreneur.
Okay. So as you were just mentioning, and in one of your recent talks, you said that you have to start with a major problem in a small industry or a niche technical problem faced by a small segment, and you sell that solution before developing one. So that basically means you don't invest in a product without validating it.
Right.
So what do you think are some of the technical challenges in Pakistan that startups should try to solve, especially given that they can't really do payments, or they don't have the infrastructure or logistics you'd have in the US, or significant investment, and there's a lot of regulatory barriers here?
Right. So I think solving the payment problem is, of course, an important problem. So a problem also represents an opportunity. So one could try to address the payment problem. I'm not super familiar with all the various mobile payment and other payment mechanisms in here, but if they aren't being widely used, we should figure out why and come up with an offering that makes it widely usable, right? So that's sort of number one. Number two, there's a lot of opportunities in a country where there's a large population. Anytime you have a large population base, there's both problems and there's the ability to solve it with a labor pool that would be looking for employment. So there's a whole plethora of business opportunities where you connect the online and the offline worlds, right? So connecting online to offline and finding the right business opportunity in the middle of that would be a great set of things to do in a large population, large landmass country like Pakistan. Other than that, I think they could focus on things that are unique to this country, or rather what I like to do, which is this country is an example of 30 other countries like it. And if we can come up with a product offering that works in a country like this, it's probably going to work in similar countries as well. So I try to think of, and which is what Sky Electric product offering is about too. This is applicable in dozens of other countries around the world, not just this one. And I intend to take this product to all of them, right? So the entrepreneur here can think about similar opportunities. And they're better suited to think about it than somebody sitting in California where they're thinking more about, satellite connectivity, or I don't know, something else, which is, not an everyday problem in this part of the world.
Okay, so the last question I'll ask you is, so obviously Pakistan doesn't have any shortage of talented tech entrepreneurs and people who studied computer science and technology, but we have a problem where there's not much investment, especially by the government, and there's not much foreign investment. What do you think the government should do to encourage more tech entrepreneurs here? What do you think we can do to get more foreign investment in Pakistan?
Right. They're both difficult questions, so I'll do my best to answer them. So the first thing is, I just recently spoke at the National Incubation Center, which is a government initiative, and they are bringing entrepreneurs in. They're giving them the basics of entrepreneurship and how to think about companies. And I think that's a good initiative. The government is funding it, paying for it. They're not funding the startups just yet. And honestly, I think funding startups by the government is going to take a lot of doing. In the United States, even though I got invested in by the US government, that was not an initial investment. That was a follow-on investment. And the philosophy of the US government investing arm there is to follow existing professional high caliber investors. We don't have any such investment pool here, right? So you can't follow. The other problem we have is, and the same problem is in the United States as well. Political parties like to use failures as reasons to cast aspersions and blame, right? So President Obama got blamed by the Republican Party for the failure of his large solar company that the US government invested $500 million in. And they said, look at what happened here and blah, blah, blah. The Chinese government does this routinely. They invest billions and billions of dollars in the private sector, because there is no opposition party that's going to come in and say, why did you do this? This investment worked out and this did not. And lots of investments don't work out. That's just a fact of life. So when you look at the fact that the startup failure rate is higher than 70 to 80%, right? Who in the government would be willing to invest and take the political flack, right? That this was some kind of corruption or this was some kind of poorly planned investment, when by the very nature of startups, in the best run startup ecosystems in the United States, the success rate of startups is really, really low, right? So I don't see a viable path for the government to get involved directly other than what it is already doing, which is fostering entrepreneurship, running incubation centers. But anytime the government wants to write a check, it'll have to deal with the issue of, was it favoritism that made you write the check? Was it somebody's corrupt motive that made you write? And it may be none of that, and the startup may still not succeed, but that's just the nature of startups, right? So foreign investment may have a hard time coming in here, given the lack of track record of entrepreneurs building global companies here, right? So we've got these two things that are going to be problematic for the local entrepreneurs. My recommendation to them is to think of very low capital intensity businesses. That's number one. Don't think about some company that's going to take millions and millions of dollars to create, because it may be very hard to raise that kind of funding. B, angel fund or crowdsource that opportunity, right? And I think there's an opportunity to be had here where somebody, business people or other people who are in traditional business want to have a portfolio of emerging businesses. They could look at opportunities, or just the public, if they want a product like Kickstarter in the United States, they can prepay for that product, and that can be a source of funding. There are a lot of countries that have had entrepreneurs build companies by the old-fashioned way, raising the money from friends, family, or the people who want to help. Right? Japan did this post-Second World War. That's how Honda Corporation was built, actually. There was no venture funding in Honda Corporation. It was just funded by friends and family and bicycle distributors around Japan, right? So it's hard. It's character building. But I would encourage them to bootstrap their way to success. And once they have some revenue success, some market penetration, maybe they can take that to foreign investors in Europe or the United States for scale-out purposes. But for the initial thing, they're going to have to figure this out on their own.
Mr. Aziz, this has been an extremely enlightening talk. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.